long before the majestic rise of Israel and Judah, a different, often overlooked story was unfolding in the shadows of the Dead Sea. In a land marked by scandal, betrayal, and tragedy, a people arose whose origins were far from royal. Born in the aftermath of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction, their tale would forever intertwine with the fate of Israel. They were the Moabites, feared, condemned, and yet curiously part of the divine tapestry that would one day lead to the birth of the Messiah. But what if I told you that the Moabites' rise was not just a simple tale of conflict? Their story is riddled with incest, betrayal, and war, the very things that shape their identity.
How did they come to stand against the mighty nation of Israel? And what was the shocking turn of events that changed their fate forever? Could it be that the Moabites' tragic past holds unexpected lessons for us today? How much of their legacy still affects the world we live in? Keep reading, because the journey of Lot's sons, their rise, and their ultimate clash with Israel will leave you questioning the very nature of fate, redemption, and God's will. Before we dive into the astonishing history, leave a 777 in the comments if you're ready to explore this forgotten chapter of the Bible and uncover secrets that might just surprise you. Are you prepared to take the first step into this tale of intrigue, conflict, and unexpected grace? Let's unravel the mysteries that the scriptures hold and see how even the darkest stories can lead to powerful revelations. Incest, betrayal, and war. How Lot's sons rose against Israel.
If you truly wish to grasp who the Moabites were, and why their very name carried such weight in Israel's unfolding story, you have to travel back to one of the most haunting and shadowed episodes found in the earliest chapters of the Bible. Picture the scene painted in Genesis 19. Imagine the skies darkened not by clouds but by billowing smoke, as God himself sent a storm of fire and burning sulfur to consume the twisted cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the midst of screams and ruin, only a small remnant escaped the inferno. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, fled with a heart pounding from terror, clutching the hands of his two daughters as they stumbled away from the smoldering remains of civilization. They found refuge far from the flames, hiding deep in the lonely folds of the mountains.
What must it have felt like to cower in that cave? Cold rock pressing against their backs. Silence heavy, save for the whisper of wind through stone. There was fear there, yes, but also a creeping madness that comes when people believe the world has ended. Lot's daughters looked around and saw only emptiness. Who would carry on their family line? Who would bear descendants to preserve their father's name? Could it be that you, standing in that dark cave with them, might have felt that same gnawing desperation? It was in this place, where shadows seemed to swallow hope whole, that an unsettling plan took shape. The daughters of Lot, convinced that no men remained alive on the earth, resolved to secure children by the only means they could imagine. They decided to intoxicate their father with wine until his senses were dulled. Then each would lie with him, ensuring their lineage continued. The scriptures do not mask this moment's discomfort. Instead, they lay it bare for all to see.
Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. Genesis 19:36 tells us plainly, holding nothing back from our scrutiny. Can you feel the eerie chill of that night? The unsettling truth that sin can be born out of fear as much as from outright rebellion. By the time dawn broke over the rugged hills, both daughters carried within them the seed of a scandal that would echo through history. The firstborn gave birth to a son and named him Moab, and the Bible declares the same is the father of the Moabites unto this day. Genesis 19:37.
Lager, is it not striking that an entire nation, one that would later grow strong enough to challenge Israel, to draw swords and spill blood on the fields of battle, to be woven into the prophecies of God's dealings with his people, began from such a dark and twisted origin? How often in our own lives do roots of future conflict take hold in moments of fear, secrecy, and desperation, only to blossom generations later into strife we could never have predicted. And so, the legacy of Moab was stained from the start, a people born out of incest and hidden shame, destined to play their own troubling part in the divine drama that was yet to unfold.
One can't help but wonder, if you were among Lot's daughters, standing at the edge of that cavern, would the weight of loneliness and terror have driven you to the same choice? Even today, does humanity not continue repeating desperate mistakes when hope seems lost, writing new stories of sorrow that echo faintly back to that ancient cave? The Bible, in its raw honesty, does not shy from humanity's brokenness. Instead, it reveals it, so that we might look closer at our own hearts. What chapter, we might quietly ask ourselves, are we writing right now in the dark?
But here's where the tale takes a startling turn, one that no ordinary human storyteller could have plotted. Though the Moabites were born out of shame and secrecy, children of fear and twisted desperation, they did not simply fade into the forgotten margins of history, as many might expect. Instead, they multiplied. They spread across the land like seeds caught by the wind, rooting themselves firmly into the soil of the earth east of the Dead Sea. Before long, they were raising mighty walls, founding bustling cities, forging their own armies, and establishing a distinctive culture. Can you imagine walking through those streets, hearing the clang of blacksmiths or the laughter of children, never suspecting that all of it traced back to one shadowy night in a cave? This territory, known in ancient days as Moab, rose defiantly from a place of scandal to carve out its mark on the map.
Its lands stretched across what we now recognize as modern-day Jordan, resting strategically to the east of the Dead Sea's shimmering expanse. Yet, for all their apparent prosperity, the Moabites lived with watchful eyes fixed on their western horizon. Who could blame them? Beyond that horizon stirred whispers of a people unlike any other, descendants of Abraham's own faith, whose story was still being written by the very hand of God. Picture it. As Israel wandered the harsh wilderness, thousands upon thousands of freed slaves transformed into a formidable nation under the shelter of pillars of cloud by day and pillars of fire by night. Every movement they made left nations trembling.
What must it have been like for the Moabites to see this vast assembly inching ever closer? Did parents clutch their children a little tighter at night? Did kings hold urgent councils, hearts pounding as scouts returned with tales of the God who split seas and brought down mighty Egypt? By the time we reach Numbers chapter 22, the stakes are impossibly high. The Israelites have pitched their tents in the plains of Moab itself, their countless campfires dotting the dark like a galaxy fallen to earth. The very sight of them sent shockwaves of dread across Moab's hills and valleys. And Moab was sore afraid of the people, because they were many, the scriptures record, with a stark honesty that makes us pause. Numbers 22:3.
Rage. Would you not have felt the same terror if you were a Moabite standing on your city walls, staring out across a horizon crowded with Israel's tents, hearing distant songs rising from a people led by a God who seemed to command the very elements? This was no distant threat. This was a living storm on Moab's doorstep.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, to see how nations born out of human mistakes, carved from secrecy and sin, can grow strong enough to stand toe-to-toe with God's chosen people. Even today, do we not see echoes of this, as flawed beginnings sometimes give rise to movements or empires that shape the fate of millions? But as we watch this tense standoff unfold, one truth becomes clear. The Moabite story was nowhere near its conclusion. Their uneasy watch over Israel would soon ignite into schemes, curses, and clashes that would echo through prophecy itself.
Who among us could have guessed that the seeds sown in that lonely mountain cave would grow into such a fierce and fearful nation? And if we found ourselves among the Moabites, looking out across that encamped multitude, would we have plotted desperately to protect our future too?
The king of Moab at that crucial moment in history was Balak, a ruler whose heart grew faint with dread as he peered across his borders. From his vantage point, the Israelites were not weary pilgrims slowly marching toward rest. They were a looming storm, a tidal wave of people poised to swallow up his lands, his cities, his very throne. Can you imagine being Balak, pacing in his royal chambers, every whisper from his scouts tightening the knot in his chest? By fear and desperate to protect what he saw as his rightful domain, Balak hatched a plan. He would not trust mere armies or fortress walls to keep this strange nation at bay. Instead, he sought out a man of uncanny reputation, someone who claimed to traffic in the mysteries of the unseen. Enter Balaam, a spiritual mercenary, a figure known far and wide for wielding words that could bless or curse with terrifying power.
What must it have felt like to be Balak, sending precious gifts and urgent pleas to secure Balaam's services, clinging to the hope that one man's utterance might halt an entire nation? Balak's message to Balaam was blunt and filled with raw fear. Come now, therefore, I pray thee, curse me this people, for they are too mighty for me. Numbers 22:6. Yet, in all his scheming, Balak failed to grasp the enormity of what he was attempting. This was not simply a political maneuver to weaken an encroaching tribe. This was, in truth, an act of defiance against the living God of Israel. How often do we see people even today trying to manipulate outcomes without realizing they are contending with forces far beyond their reach? Discharged no time in responding. He met Balaam directly, warning him in unmistakable terms not to curse Israel. This nation was under divine favor, shielded by promises that reached back to Abraham himself.
So when Balaam finally arrived at Balak's summons, the stage was set for a spectacle no earthly power could control. Picture Balak's elaborate preparations. Altars painstakingly constructed on scenic heights, smoke from sacrifices curling into the sky, a nervous hush falling over the gathered princes. Balaam lifts his voice, perhaps even expecting venom to spill forth. But instead of curses, blessings pour out. Words so soaked in divine authority that the air itself must have seemed to tremble. 3 separate times this unfolds. Can you see Balak's face, reddening with fury, hands clenched so tight his knuckles blanch, as Balaam again and again proclaims God's favor over Israel? By the third oracle, the revelation breaks through in language that echoes through eternity. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab. Numbers 24:17. Pause and let that vision take root.
This wasn't merely about Israel's coming military triumph over Moab.
It was something infinitely larger. In this pronouncement, the shadow of Christ appears. Jesus, the bright morning star, the scepter destined to rule, judge, and redeem. Isn't it astonishing that right there, in the high places of Moab where curses were meant to be cast, God unveiled a glimpse of the Messiah who would one day crush not only nations but the very spiritual powers arrayed against his people? Imagine standing among Balak's courtiers, hearing these words thunder out. Would your legs have gone weak? Would you have sensed, even without fully understanding, that history itself was being shaped before your eyes? What strikes us even now is how God used what Balak intended for harm to declare one of Scripture's clearest messianic prophecies.
Moab, the land that tried to orchestrate Israel's downfall through dark incantations, became the unlikely platform for proclaiming the victory of Christ, King of Kings, who would both shepherd his flock and strike down their fiercest enemies. Isn't that a truth that still resonates? So often, the very places meant to witness our destruction become the stages where God's greatest triumphs are announced. And if you found yourself there on that dusty plain of Moab, watching altars burn and hearing heaven's secrets spill forth, would you have grasped just how far-reaching these words were?
Even today, do we not live in the unfolding of that same divine story, waiting for the star of Jacob to rise once more in final, unchallenged glory?
But even then, the saga between Moab and Israel was far from its final line, because the next chapter in their entangled history would introduce a battlefield unlike any seen before, one where blades and curses were replaced by smiles, alluring eyes, and feasts that beckon the soul to drift from holiness. The Moabites proved themselves to be far more treacherous than mere warriors wielding swords. They became something infinitely more dangerous, a living, breathing snare, draped in charm and false splendor, waiting to catch the hearts of God's people. It all unfolds in the haunting pages of Numbers, chapter 25. This time, the enemy didn't arrive brandishing spears or marching in rank. They came laughing. They came inviting. Picture the scene. The sun setting warm over Moab's hills, tables heavy with delicacies, music floating on the breeze, laughter ringing through camps where Moabite women moved like dancers among the Israelites.
Their invitations seemed harmless enough. Who would suspect danger in the promise of a meal, a dance, a moment of joy? Could you honestly say your own feet wouldn't have strayed toward those glowing lanterns and tempting aromas? At first, it was only shared bread, cups raised in friendly toast. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the feast's laughter led to something darker. Altars to Baal appeared, glittering with offerings. The songs shifted from celebration to ritual. And there, in the half-light of evening, hands joined not in innocent greeting, but in a union twisted with idolatry and lust. What began as neighborly companionship unraveled into outright spiritual treason. The Israelites, who had once stood in awe as the Red Sea tore open before them, who had feasted on bread fallen from the very heavens, who had drunk from water gushing out of barren rock, these same people now knelt before statues of wood and stone.
They traded the infinite majesty of the living God for dead idols, for images with mouths that could not speak and eyes that could not see. How fragile is the human heart when charmed by what it thinks harmless. Psalm 106 tells us with somber clarity, they joined themselves also unto Baal Peor and ate the sacrifices of the dead. Thus they provoked him to anger with their inventions, and the plague brake in upon them. And God's judgment was neither delayed nor diluted. Imagine waking up to find the joyful songs of your camp replaced by wailing as death swept through the tents like an unseen wind. 24,000 souls perished under that divine plague, entire families lost. Fires that once cooked daily bread now smoldered cold beside empty sleeping mats.
Beige. Is it not chilling to realize how swiftly comfort can slip into compromise? How quickly a feast can become a funeral? Would you have seen it coming had you been there? Or would the music have drowned out your caution too? And so, over generations, Moab came to stand for more than a plot of land east of the Dead Sea. It became a living symbol of the subtle enemies that still creep up on God's people. Idolatry dressed in the soft robes of pleasure, arrogance masquerading as cultural pride, corruption cloaked beneath age-old tradition. It was never just the carved images that invited God's wrath. It was the pride that burned behind Moab's smiling face, the arrogance that whispered, "We don't need the God of Israel. We'll carve our own way, worship on our own terms." Through his prophets, God left no doubt about how he viewed such defiance.
"We have heard the pride of Moab," thundered Jeremiah. "He is exceeding proud. His loftiness and his arrogancy and his pride and the haughtiness of his heart." Jeremiah 48:29. And it was precisely this swelling pride that would lead Moab not to triumph, but to ruin.
Does it not still happen today? Where the promise of harmless enjoyment gradually blinds entire lives to what lies at the altar's edge. Where hearts once aflame for God slowly kneel before lesser things, success, pleasure, the applause of men. And if you found yourself amid that Moabite celebration, would you have recognized the snare in time? Or would you have danced forward, only to awaken too late to the cost? Moab's story warns us with every echo of its downfall. Spiritual seduction rarely comes wearing the face of an obvious enemy. More often, it arrives smiling with an outstretched hand, inviting you to a feast that ends at the edge of a grave.
We've watched how Moab once lured Israel into idolatry, wrapping snares in laughter and feasting until the chosen people stumbled into spiritual ruin. But as time marched on, new chapters were written, chapters not of seduction, but of lament and devastating prophecy. We leap ahead now by centuries, landing somewhere around 715 BC. The mighty Assyrian Empire was sweeping like an unstoppable tempest across the Near East, swallowing nations one by one, its armies darkening the horizon with iron and war banners. And it is precisely here, against this backdrop of gathering doom, that the Spirit of God descends upon the prophet Isaiah, placing a heavy burden upon his soul, a burden that is both a cry of grief and a chilling declaration of judgment against Moab.
Can you imagine Isaiah, perhaps standing alone in the stillness of evening, as divine words surge through him like fire, demanding to be spoken aloud? He opens his oracle with a line that hangs in the air like a funeral bell. Because in the night, Ar of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. Isaiah 15:1. How haunting that first blow lands. Ar was not just any settlement. It was Moab's proud fortress, a city carved into the sheer cliffs of the Arnon Gorge, rising out of stone like a testimony to their confidence and might. Yet Isaiah doesn't foretell its fall at dawn, when warriors might muster at the gates. He sees it crushed in the black of night, sudden and merciless, leaving no time to rally swords or shield trembling families. And Isaiah does not stop with Ar.
Like a solemn tolling bell, he calls out the names of Moab's most cherished towns: Nebo, Medeba, Dibon, Heshbon, Eleale, each one destined to echo not with festival songs or chants to their gods, but with sobbing voices, with priests and nobles alike tearing their garments in anguish. What would it have felt like to stand in one of those cities, hearing Isaiah's prophecy, your market streets alive for now with trade and laughter, all while knowing that soon they would run red and empty? Meliores, Mies, Isaiah 16, painting a scene almost too heartbreaking to bear. Moab's famed warriors, men once hailed for their courage, scatter like frightened sparrows. Proud soldiers become fugitives overnight, slipping away under cover of darkness with their faces hidden, trying to outrun the tidal wave of Assyria's legions. Meanwhile, Moab's common people pour into the wilderness, crossing harsh desert sands with blistered feet, desperately seeking refuge in Judah's lands.
They knock at Judah's door with sun-cracked lips, pleading for water, for bread, for mercy. Would your heart have closed against them, knowing how Moab once led Israel astray? Or would compassion have stirred, despite old wounds? Isaiah's vision does not neglect Moab's pride either, especially its celebrated wealth drawn from the earth itself. The terraces of Sibmah, renowned for vineyards so lush their wines traveled all the way to the bustling ports of Tyre, become scenes of ruin. Imagine the delicate green of grape leaves scorched to ash, soldiers' boots crushing the fruit that once promised laughter at feasts.
The very hills that drape themselves in orderly rows of vines, cascading down white limestone slopes, now smolder under foreign torches. This, Isaiah makes clear, it was not only Moab's idols, or even their past snares that brought judgment upon them. It was their swelling pride, the arrogance that said, "Our harvests make us secure.
Our fortresses keep us safe. We need nothing, not even the God of Israel."
Is that not a haunting reflection of human hearts today, still building monuments of self-reliance, still trusting in the strength of their own hands, oblivious to how swiftly a single night can change everything?
So Isaiah lifts his voice like a dirge over Moab, watching in prophetic vision as cities wail, vineyards burn, warriors flee, and refugees trudge across a pitiless wilderness. And if you stood beside him, seeing these images unfold on the horizon of your mind, would you feel sorrow for Moab's fall, or a solemn warning echoing in your own spirit? Because often it is not only ancient nations that stand at risk of being brought low by pride. Sometimes it is the unseen kingdoms we build quietly inside our hearts.
The Lord devotes an entire chapter, Jeremiah 48, to Moab alone. Imagine that, an entire prophetic scroll section set aside to unravel the fate of this ancient foe. Among its many solemn lines stands one that echoes like a final verdict from heaven's court. And Moab shall be destroyed from being a people, because he hath magnified himself against the Lord. Jeremiah 48:42. Could there be a more dreadful sentence for any nation to be erased, not by accident but by divine decree? Not leave Moab's indictment vague, he names each crime with piercing clarity. First, there was arrogance, a haughty spirit that strutted beneath Chemosh's pagan altars, boasting in gods carved by craftsmen's hands. Then mockery, rejoicing with cruel laughter when Judah fell before Babylon's siege engines, as though Israel's agony were a festival for Moab's pride. Finally, there was outright malice, raiding Israel's weakened borders when she staggered under foreign chains, striking the wounded without mercy. Can you see the pattern? Pride puffed up their hearts, mockery twisted compassion into scorn, and violence completed the fall. So God delivered a chilling fourfold judgment. Their fortified cities would be toppled into dust, their people scattered like leaves torn by an autumn gale. Their once proud cultural identity would be stripped away until their very name became little more than a bitter proverb on passing lips. In the closing lines of this oracle, the Lord speaks almost through gritted teeth to Babylon's soldiers. Bring more salt, lay waste her cities, leave no shoots for the vine dresser. A command to utterly sterilize the land, so even hope itself could not sprout. Could there be anything more terrifying than a decree from God that not a single green shoot be left to grow? History marches precisely in step with these dire words.
In the 8th century BC, Assyria trampled Moab under iron sandals. 2 centuries later, Babylon crushed the remnants that still clung to power. By the time of the Persian Empire, Moab was no longer a proud kingdom, but a mere outlying province. Under Rome, the territory was folded into Arabia Petraea, stripped of its ancient glory. And after the 2nd century AD, the name Moab itself faded from geopolitical maps, surviving only in ruins and inscriptions buried beneath what is now Jordan's soil. Exactly as God had sworn through Jeremiah, Moab shall be destroyed from being a people. If you were to walk those lands today, your feet would tread on dust that once heard Moabite hymns to Chemosh, You might stumble across fragments of mud brick walls or toppled stelae, the faint etchings of their proud kings nearly swallowed by time.
No more armies, no more thrones, just silence and stone, echoing the truth that God gives long seasons for repentance. But human arrogance often refuses the gift. How many years did Moab bask in wealth and security, whispering to itself, "We are safe, we are strong, we can harm God's chosen and never pay the price"? Yet the harvest of pride always comes due. By the time the New Testament story begins, the world has changed beyond recognition. Rome's legions enforce the Pax Romana, and Herod, an uneasy puppet king, sits upon a throne crafted by political intrigue rather than divine anointing. Moab is gone, her voice stilled, her stage empty, and into that silence steps a different kind of kingdom. One not founded on arrogance, but on the astonishing humility of a child laid in a manger.
Is it not a miracle of divine irony that Jesus, the Messiah, the very star prophesied to rise out of Jacob, descends from Ruth, a Moabite woman who once fled her own cursed land to cling to the God of Israel? From a nation judged for towering pride comes a humble ancestor through whom God brings salvation to all peoples. Even the ruins of Moab seem to whisper the timeless warning written later in James chapter 4, verse 6. God resists the proud, but gives grace unto the humble. So when you look upon the broken relics of ancient Moab, or trace your fingers across dusty inscriptions that once boasted of human might, can you hear that whisper? It cautions every heart, ancient or modern, that kingdoms of pride will always fall. But those who bow low under God's hand will be lifted in due time. Would your own heart today be found among the ruins, or among the humble who inherit a kingdom that will never fade?
Now here's where the story of Moab does something utterly unexpected, where the dark corridors of judgment suddenly swing open to reveal a slender beam of grace slipping quietly through. Even as Moab's strongholds were crushed under Assyrian boots and her pride lay shattered before Babylon's fury, not every heart in that land raised a defiant fist against the God of Israel. Some, in hushed corners and humble moments, opened themselves to a better hope. And among them stands one woman whose quiet decision would echo through eternity, altering not just her destiny, but the fate of nations. Her name was Ruth. Turn with trembling hands to the slim book that bears her name. It opens not on celebration, but on sorrow. A Hebrew family from Bethlehem, Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons, fled famine's cruel grip and sought refuge in Moab. There, amid foreign streets and unfamiliar altars, the sons took Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. Fleeting moment, it must have seemed life was turning sweet again. But within a decade, every man in that household was gone, carried off by untimely death. The famine behind them had given way to funerals beside them, leaving 3 widows to weep together in a land not their own. Naomi, hollowed by grief and calling herself Mara, meaning bitter, resolved to return home to Bethlehem, though she confessed she had nothing left but sorrow. She urged her daughters-in-law to remain in Moab, to rebuild their lives among their own people and gods. Orpah wept, then kissed Naomi goodbye and turned back, understandably, perhaps, to the only life she'd ever known.
But Ruth, this young Moabite widow with eyes full of steadfast light, clung fiercely to Naomi's side.
And from her lips tumbled one of Scripture's most breathtaking declarations. Entreat me not to leave thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God.
Ruth 1:16.
Pause a heartbeat.
In that single vow, Ruth renounced Chemosh and the legacy of Moab's idols. She crossed an invisible line, tying her future irrevocably to Israel and the God of Abraham. That was more than loyalty. It was full conversion. Can you imagine the weight of that choice? Would you, standing on the dusty road with your whole life behind you, have taken such a step into the unknown? Back in Bethlehem, life did not instantly blossom into ease. Ruth lived as a foreigner, a widow, on the fringes of Israel's social fabric. To survive, she gleaned, following harvesters to pick up stray stalks of barley, an act of humble dependence allowed by God's law for the poor and the stranger. Leviticus 19:9-10. Little did she know that she was gleaning in fields belonging to Boaz, a wealthy and upright man from Naomi's own clan, a potential kinsman redeemer. Picture Ruth bent low among the sheaves, sweat on her brow, hands scratched by straw, determined to feed Naomi. Boaz noticed. He watched not merely her beauty but her courage, her work-worn diligence, and her extraordinary love for Naomi, a love that had left homeland and family far behind. He spoke words over her that still seemed to hover gentle across the centuries. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Ruth 2:12. Through the ancient law of Goel, Redeemer marriage, Boaz purchased Naomi's lost inheritance and took Ruth as his wife. That once despised Moabite widow became the honored bride of an Israelite noble, clothed not in shame but in dignity. Out of their union came a child named Obed, who would cradle in his arms the seeds of promise.
Obed would father Jesse, and Jesse would raise David, the shepherd king who wrote psalms by moonlight and defeated giants by daylight. Let that sink in. Can you see how a nation born of incest, judged for idolatry, crushed for arrogance, still offered up a woman whose humble faith rewrote the very genealogy of redemption? By the time you reach the opening words of Matthew's Gospel, the Spirit ensures Ruth's name is there among only 4 Gentile women in Jesus' lineage. It is as though God underlined for us that his salvation story is not pure because it was free of outsiders, but because his grace reached out to fold in even Moab's shadowed past. Isn't it staggering that the bloodstream of the Messiah carried Moabite DNA? The same God who judged Moab for sin turned and adopted Moab into his grand design of salvation. So when you hear the word Moab, let it stir more than memories of fortresses reduced to rubble or altars toppled under divine wrath.
Picture, instead, a young widow gleaning in golden fields outside Bethlehem, a foreigner under the wings of Israel's God,
her story stitching a scarlet thread of grace that runs unbroken from a cave outside Sodom all the way to an empty tomb outside Jerusalem. Is that not the very heart of redemption? That out of ashes God can raise beauty, out of cursed lineages He can birth kings. Out of your deepest regrets, He can craft legacies that bless generations. And as you stand here, looking back across this long, tangled history, could it be that He still whispers to you, no matter how far your story has strayed, that grace is never out of reach?
So what then ultimately became of the Moabites? Where did these people who once boasted towering citadels, lush vineyards, and altars wreathed in incense vanish to? Historically, after centuries upon centuries of clashes with Israel, after ignoring prophetic cries that rang through their valleys like alarm bells, the Moabites gradually faded from the world's grand stage. Their warriors, once confident in their numbers and gods, were repeatedly humbled on blood-soaked fields. Mighty cities like Ar carved defiantly into the cliffs, and Dibon, whose high places, once burned with offerings to Chemosh, fell to wave after wave of foreign invaders. Picture those proud walls, battered by siege towers, finally crumbling into choking dust. Their temples were not spared. The very sanctuaries where Moabite priests once chanted and danced now lay in ruin, their idols toppled, noses broken, eyes gouged out, mute and powerless to save themselves or their worshippers.
And with each generation swallowed by conquest, famine, or exile, the memory of Moab dimmed from the records of empires. Can you feel the eerie silence that would have hung over those abandoned streets, where once processions marched and merchants called out their wares? By the dawn of the New Testament era, Moab was no longer a threat rattling swords at Israel's borders. They were not even a recognized kingdom. They lingered only as a ghost in history's corridors, a cautionary echo. Some scholars suggest that as the tides of war and forced migrations swept across the region, the remaining Moabites were quietly absorbed into the peoples of Ammon, Edom, and the shifting tribes of Arabia. Others believe that the relentless hammering of judgment through Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Rome simply erased them, like a name scraped off a monument, leaving barely a whisper in the dust.
Lage scholarly debates, one unassailable truth stands firm. When God speaks a word of judgment, it does not return empty. It completes its purpose, as surely as the rains carve paths down a mountainside. The fate of Moab was sealed not by accident or blind historical forces, but by the sovereign hand of the Lord, who declared, through Jeremiah, "Moab shall be destroyed from being a people, because he hath magnified himself against the Lord." Jeremiah 48:42. But, this is where the story shivers with something beautiful and almost scandalous. Just as certain as God's judgment is, so too is His mercy. The tale of Moab is not only a grim lesson written in toppled stones and lost genealogies. It's also a quiet breath of hope that rustles through the pages of Scripture. The Bible shows us that God does indeed judge pride. He does not turn a blind eye to arrogance, cruelty, and rebellion.
How many times did Moab trust in its wealth, its walls, and its pagan gods, smirking at Israel's distress, certain they would never be touched? Yet God's justice is patient, not absent, and it finally overtook them. Still, equally woven through this story is a truth that should stop our hearts with wonder. God redeems the humble. He lifts up those who turn toward Him with nothing but empty hands and open hearts. Even people born of scandalous beginnings.
conceived in incest in a shadowed cave outside Sodom. Even a nation infamous for seducing God's chosen into vile idol worship. Even a solitary woman from Moab who, in quiet courage, chose Yahweh over Chemosh, loyalty over ease, humility over pride, and found herself woven into a royal line. Does that not pierce right through all our human fears about unworthiness? Perhaps your own family story feels tangled with pain or shame. Perhaps you look back and see nothing but shattered pieces, generations marked by bitterness, loss, or sin.
Maybe your life itself feels small, unremarkable, overshadowed by what came before. But let this sink deep into your bones. The same God who took Ruth the Moabite, whose people were under centuries of judgment, and placed her directly into the ancestral line of Jesus Christ, is more than able to redeem your story too. He does not merely erase the stains of your past, he transforms them into a testimony that declares his grace. So what truly happened to the Moabites? In one sense, their pride led them to destruction. Their cities fell, their people scattered, their legacy crumbled. Yet in another breathtaking sense, their story did not end with dust and silence. Through one humble heart, a Moabite widow gleaning grain behind the reapers, God carved a path for redemption that ran all the way to Bethlehem's stable and ultimately to a rugged cross outside Jerusalem.
That is the haunting, hopeful rhythm of Scripture. Judgment for the proud, mercy for the humble, eternal hope for those who dare to believe. Can you see how even the ruins of Moab still whisper this truth across the ages? And standing there amid your own uncertainties, doesn't it make you wonder what God might yet write into your life? If you trust Him to take your broken chapters and breathe grace all the way through them?
So what then can we truly learn from the Moabites today? Far more than most would ever imagine. Their story may be buried under the dust of ancient wars and forgotten dynasties, yet it rises like a voice from the grave, echoing truths that pierce right into our present lives. Let's draw out 3 profound lessons that their rise, fall, and unexpected redemption still whisper to every heart willing to listen. First, God looks past heritage, straight into the depths of the heart. Consider Ruth, born into Moab, a nation overshadowed by scandal, birthed from the shadows of incest, cursed for seducing Israel into idolatry, crushed under waves of judgment. By all accounts, she should have been forever disqualified. Imagine the way people may have looked at her with suspicion or whispered about her lineage. Yet God was not scanning her ancestry, He was searching for faith.
And when Ruth stood beside Naomi on that lonely road, her words weren't just a promise, they were a covenant of the soul. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. Ruth 1:16. In that moment, every chain of the past shattered. God welcomed her fully into His family, grafted her into Israel's story, and astonishingly placed her name in the very genealogy of the Messiah. Doesn't that spark hope for you? Where you come from, your family's flaws, your past mistakes, even the shame you might carry, cannot confine what God can write next. He's not sifting through your background looking for reasons to reject you. He's searching for a heart that will trust Him completely. Could it be that right now, even in your private uncertainties, He sees something others can't, a humble willingness that heaven treasures? Second, we learn that sin always leaves scars. But grace is never out of reach.
Moab's national story was painted in bold strokes of arrogance, perversion, and spiritual betrayal. They tempted Israel to bow before false gods. They mocked when Judah staggered under Babylon's assault. They raided Israel's borders when God's people were weakest, adding insult to injury. And so judgment rolled in like a storm they could not escape. Yet even amid that dark legacy, grace found a crack in the walls. Through one humble, tender-hearted woman who laid aside her gods, her pride, and her homeland for the God of Israel, redemption blossomed. God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. James 4:6. Isn't that the same story he keeps telling across generations? Sin devastates, always has, but humility before God opens the floodgates of mercy. If Moab's dark tapestry could be pierced by a single thread of faith, imagine what God might do in your life if you laid everything down at his feet.
Aber. Third, God's plans are infinitely more expansive than anything we can dream. To the watching world, Moab was simply another enemy nation, just one more hostile tribe standing in the way of Israel's inheritance, a mere footnote in the vast annals of history. But in God's sovereign eyes, they were part of a breathtaking plotline that would weave itself right into salvation's heart. Out of this rejected, judged people came Ruth. From Ruth came Obed. From Obed came Jesse. And from Jesse came David, Israel's greatest king. Centuries later, from David's line would come Jesus, Savior of the world. Never underestimate what God might be orchestrating through a life fully surrendered to Him. Even if others have written you off or treated your story as insignificant, even if your family history feels tangled with pain or insignificance, God sees differently.
For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is perfect toward him. 2 Chronicles 16:9. Could your humble trust be the very soil where he plans to plant seeds of something far greater than you could ever envision? He is still writing stories. He is still redeeming broken names, still reaching into forgotten places, still choosing the most unlikely souls to fulfill his eternal purposes. Which gently presses a question into your spirit. Are you living out of quiet humility or hidden pride? Are you resisting God's gentle pull or running toward him with all you have left? Because if we're honest, the story of the Moabites is not just their story, it's also ours. Every one of us has been born into a world stained by rebellion, shaped by the inheritance of sin. We've all wandered paths lined with idols of comfort, prestige, and selfish ambition.
We've all bowed our hearts at one time or another before gods that cannot speak or save. Just like Moab, we stand in desperate need of grace. And yet, here's the wonder that makes the ground of our souls tremble. Our God delights to take those who humble themselves, turn from empty altars, and cling to him with desperate trust. He weaves them into legacies they could never have written for themselves. That's why the story of Moab still matters. It's a divine echo across time, declaring judgment upon the proud, but endless hope for the humble, an unbreakable promise for any heart that dares to believe. Your past may shape you, but it does not have the power to define what God can redeem. But lean in and hear this carefully, because it is perhaps the most astonishing truth tucked inside the entire Moabite saga. The very God who judged Moab for its pride, its idolatry, and its cruelty is the same God who stooped down, reached right into the ashes of Moab's broken legacy, and tenderly drew out a woman named Ruth. Through her, he opened a doorway of grace that swung wide enough for every nation, every family line, every broken heart. Isn't that breathtaking?
It means no matter how stained your past might be, no matter how many times your feet have stumbled along roads that led you far from Him, you still have the same invitation that Ruth once heard whispering to her soul. So, what did Ruth do that so transformed her story and ultimately changed the destiny of the world? She made 3 quiet, courageous choices that echo across time. First, she turned. She pivoted away from the lifeless idols of Moab, from all the hollow traditions and the empty pursuits that could never heal or satisfy. Isn't that the crossroads we all reach? Where we stand looking back at comfort zones, familiar but powerless to save, and ahead at an uncertain path toward God? Second, she clung, with Naomi standing before her, urging her to return to what she knew. Ruth instead wrapped her arms around a new hope. She grabbed hold of the living God and refused to let go. "Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God," she declared, Ruth 1:16. It was not a half-hearted agreement. It was an all-in surrender that risked everything familiar for the promise of belonging to Yahweh. Third, she followed. She stepped out in faith onto a road that led into the unknown, into Bethlehem, into fields where she would glean behind strangers, into a future she could not possibly have mapped out. How often does true redemption begin? With a single, trembling step into uncertainty, trusting that God is who He says He is. Scripture seals this promise for us with unshakable certainty. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Romans chapter 10, verse 13. Let that word whosoever settle deeply. It leaves no room for exclusion. It swings the door wide enough for Moabites and Israelites, for the respectable and the disgraced, for you and for me. Jesus did not come solely for Israel, or only for those with pristine family trees and tidy stories. He came for the world. He came for wanderers from every tribe and tongue. He came for the bruised and battered, for those carrying generational burdens, for those whose hearts have been fractured by poor choices and darker seasons. He came for you. So maybe you see something of yourself in Moab's history, a past twisted by failures, years wasted chasing empty gods, pride that built fortresses around your heart.
Or maybe you feel more like Ruth, standing at a crossroad, clutching a fragile hope that there's more to your story than where you've come from. Either way, the invitation remains the same. Turn, cling, follow. Because the same God who wove Ruth's simple faith into a royal bloodline that led to Christ stands ready to take your surrender, no matter how broken, and craft it into something eternally beautiful. Isn't that what makes grace so astonishing? That He doesn't just rescue you from your past, He redeems it and writes it into His masterpiece. And that, more than anything else, is why this ancient story still matters for your life today.
So when we step back and take in this whole saga of incest in a cave outside Sodom, of betrayal and seduction that ensnared Israel, of proud cities that once laughed at Judah's fall and later crumbled into dust, of war and prophecy and judgment, what are we really left with? More than just a haunting story buried in ancient pages, we're left with a living message, a mirror held up to our own hearts. Because woven through the rise and ruin of Moab is a profound truth, that where we come from does not have to dictate where God can lead us. The Moabites were born in shame, seduced others into sin, mocked God's people, and paid the price for their arrogance. And yet, through one humble woman named Ruth, God showed the world that He can reach into even the darkest histories, into families scarred by scandal and nations crushed by judgment, and bring forth a line of kings. Even more astonishing, He brought forth the Savior of the world. That means there's hope for your story too.
Maybe you come from a background marred by pain, or decisions that still haunt you. Maybe pride has built up walls in your life, or perhaps, like Israel, you've bowed before idols of comfort, success, or approval, forgetting the God who split seas for you. But friend, the same God who redeemed Ruth's story can redeem yours. His grace is strong enough to rewrite even the most tragic scripts. So, what is the heartbeat of this entire history? It's that God humbles the proud, yet He lifts up the humble. It's that judgment is real because God is holy, but so is mercy because God is love. And just as Ruth stepped away from her old gods and embraced a new life under the wings of Yahweh, you can turn, cling, and follow Him, no matter how complicated your past. Let that inspire you today, that even your deepest wounds or most tangled family histories can become places where God plants seeds of redemption.
From the ashes of Moab, God brought forth David, and from David, Jesus, who now offers that same hope to you. If this message stirred something in your heart, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment. Maybe just type 77 to say, God, rewrite my story too. Like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what God might speak next. And if you feel led, consider giving through super thanks to help us keep telling these powerful biblical stories. Your support means more than words can express. Thank you for spending this time with me, for opening your heart to these ancient lessons that are still alive today. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He lift His face upon you and give you peace. And may your story, no matter where it began, become a testimony of His breathtaking, unstoppable grace.